Rebecca, I suggest we start discussing not too late.
Thank you.
Changing the climate story from despair to possibility. This book was published recently in 2023.
Last year. Yes.
You co-edited this book. Mm-hmm. You write in this book as well as artist, scientist, and activist. And all of you are trying to tackle the main challenge of today, which is the climate crisis, emphasizing the importance of stories, because the stories can either open or close possibilities.
Exactly.
What are those stories that we should tell ourselves to address the climate change?
One is that we have the solutions, we know what to do, and that the obstacles are only political. Another is that the great majority of human beings on Earth now care about climate change, want support climate action, government spending money on climate. The obstacle is not human nature or people in general, it's the minority of people with financial and political interests in fossil fuel and the status quo. And another is that although we're often told we live in an age of abundance, and if we do what the climate requires of us, we will have to give things up and live in scarcity, you can turn that story inside out and say, we now live in scarcity, scarcity of clean air, clean water, scarcity of confidence in our society, hope for the future, time to have strong relationships with each other and with nature. We could gain all that if we respond to the climate crisis in the best possible way. So there's lots and lots of stories people tell that really defeat them before they start, keep them from participating. And I think my collaborator, Thelma Young Lutuna Tabua, who's based in Fiji, and I, based in San Francisco, California, see essentially we need to build a climate movement stronger than that small minority of corporations, governments, powerful interests, and so we're not trying to fight our enemies, we're trying to motivate our friends to see what we've already done. There's a whole list of climate victories in the book. Understand that there's a movement, look at all the different aspects, the science, the politics, the technology, but also the social and emotional parts. So we have the Buddhist teacher, Joan Halifax. We have indigenous people from around the world, particularly the South Pacific, the climate scientists, et cetera, all giving positive and constructive perspectives.
In relation to that, activism often begins by working on the margins of society.
Yeah.
As an activist of various causes, you know this well. This has been the case in the United States since the abolitionist movement. Thinking about your work, what transformative power do you attribute to words? Words.
We live in stories the same way we live in air, the same way fish live in water. There are stories that function like cages and prisons, prevent us from our own possibilities, from moving freely through the world. There are other stories that liberate us and invite us into our own power, into connection, into hope and possibility. There was a period in the US where everybody kept saying, oh, stories are wonderful, we love stories. But there are stories about, women's inferiority to men. There are defeatist stories, cynical stories, stories about justifying racial inequality or cruelty, stories denying history. I just visited your Museum of Memory and Human Rights, and it made me think a lot about people in my own country denying history. So there are terrible stories, there are wonderful stories. There are imprisoning stories and liberatory stories. And often to change the world, you start by changing the story, what's possible, what the world could look like, what justice needs, what justice looks like. You can see that with any human rights movement. First, you make the problem visible. You describe why the status quo is wrong. You describe what's possible, why it's moral and right. You recruit people. And every activist movement is partly about telling another story about you may never have seen the rainforest, but it's very important to protect it. You can't see the upper atmosphere, but we're changing it by burning fossil fuel and releasing methane gas. Here's what we can do to save it. So yeah, it's all stories. And it's not only stories. The stories are where we begin. They have to end up by being, solar farms, wind turbines, the cessation of extraction of fossil fuel, electric cars in public transit instead of gas cars, agriculture that's healthier for the environment. So we ultimately need very practical things for climate, but it begins with telling stories about why it needs to change, how it can change, and why we will benefit if it does change.
Do you often emphasize the political function of hope? Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, it was interesting. I ran into a woman who lives in the Amazon who was not very pleased about me talking about hope, but for me, I live in the United States. There are a lot of people whose lives are pretty safe and comfortable who give up very easily. It's impossible. And our book is called Not Too Late, and our project, because people are like, it's too late, we lost the chance to do anything. People almost seem to look for excuses to do nothing, because if you're desperate, if you're a refugee, if you're in a dictatorship, if you give up, maybe you'll die, you'll lose everything, you'll become a refugee, lose your homeland, lose your life. For comfortable people, giving up often means you'll just go be apolitical and carry on. But there is really, I find in the United States, a lot of despair tied to two things. One of them is, I think, a serious misunderstanding of change. It comes from lack of memory, I think. The idea that change is direct and immediate, or you failed. You have a protest and you demand something on Tuesday. If you don't get it on Wednesday, then you failed. And often change is indirect. It takes a while. It doesn't work in predictable ways. And the other assumption is about power, the assumption that power belongs to a very few people in the center of things. But we see how grassroots movements, ordinary people can and do change the world, how nonviolent resistance has mattered in countries around the world, can topple regimes. And the climate movement has obviously not done enough, but it's built public consciousness, it's pushed things that became legislation and then became realities as energy policies and stopping extracting fossil fuel, protecting this nature, etc. And under all that, I think, is a lack of memory. We can't see the future, but we can see the past and we can learn from it how change works. And then also, to end this, I often see that people think the future has already been decided. And so I see, at least in the US, people speak as though we already know what's going to happen, whether they're optimistic or pessimistic, cynical or despairing. They speak as though the future has been decided. And there are certain things that are impossible. We can never make it as though we never burned all those fossil fuels. But the future is something we're making in the present. It hasn't happened yet. It's not decided. So there's these kind of false stories and false frameworks that I think really prevent people from seeing the possibilities. So I've been talking about hope it's going on for 21 years, not just to make people feel good, although I'm a nice person, but really to motivate them to engage and to stay engaged.
For decades, in your country, the United States, left-wing critical thinking has often centered around identity politics. But several intellectuals, even those from the left, have been highly critical about this focus. They argue that this fragmentation has weakened the left by diminishing its ability to propose common horizons to the citizenry. Do you consider this criticism valid? And more important than that, do you think that feminism can play a role as an articulator of all these progressive causes?
Yeah. There is a way that identity politics in the 1980s really put people in their own little spaces fighting for one thing. What we need is what we call in English sometimes intersectionality, understanding how all these things, how race, how gender, the environment, climate, democracy, et cetera, are connected. But you can't dismiss these things. Women did not, I don't know when women got the right to vote in Chile. They did not get the right to vote until my grandmothers were adults in the United States. And, how can you ignore the politics of who has full and equal rights? A woman who's beaten by her husband does not have full, cannot be a full citizen. She's too busy surviving. A person who's so oppressed by racism. The history of genocide against indigenous people from Tierra del Fuego to Alaska matters. And so I think part of it is seeing the connection that these things are not isolated. My struggle is not separate from your struggle. It's all a human rights struggle. And you can't have a left without a commitment to human rights. And we've had versions of that left, but it's ended up loving authoritarians, privileging the few over the many. Often I see these critiques of identity politics coming from white men. And one way you can put that is white men just want the identity politics of white men as being better, more important, having more rights, having the right to oppress other people to persist. It's not that they're against identity politics. They just want their identity politics.
In your memoir, which is there, let me... This one, in Spanish, Recollections of My Non-Existence, you define the best non-fiction literature as an art of distinguishing constellations in the night sky.
Yeah.
This art, you say, is both creative and destructive. I think that in this memoir, in a sense, you are proposing your poetics. Could you tell more about it?
Yeah, I once said the stars were given, the constellations we make. The stars are the stars. They existed long before human beings evolved. But when we draw pictures, a bear, a dipper, a queen on her chair, a scorpion in the sky, we're essentially making stories. We're making human culture. For me, nonfiction often is picking out a constellation. There's a relationship between this historical fact and this idea and this possibility, or between this thing that happened in the 19th century and where we are right now. So it's building relationships, like drawing lines between the stars. And in this book, I wanted to talk about the contradictions of my life, all the forces that silence young women, and my own strange life as a young woman, in which I both experienced a very normal amount of silencing, but was also trying to become a writer, which is to say a person with a public voice, and how those two things happen together. And, and I grew up to be a nonfiction writer. I have, I think, 25 books so far. Clearly, I'm talking to somebody in Chile. I have a voice. But because so many forces conspired to try and keep me quiet, to make it difficult to speak, I've felt a commitment to try and find the stories that aren't being told, listen to the people who are supposed to be voiceless, change whose story gets told, why this book is called Whose Story Is This?, which looks very much at who we center the story on. Do we center the story on the refugee or the people already in the country, the victim or the perpetrator, the rich or the poor, the conservative or, the radical? And so drawing constellations is one way I like to think of what I do.
In another of your books, Wanderlust, A History of Walking, you state that language is like a path. In what sense?
Yeah, it's, we follow what's been said or what's possible to say. One interesting project recently, there's a project in New York City called the Endangered Language Institute, because more than 800 languages are spoken in New York City. It's the linguistic capital of the world, often with refugees from the Andes, the Himalayas, places where people have had to leave because of political or environmental violence. And, language itself, you see the world differently. In a language where every noun is gendered, then the gender-neutral English, you see, the world differently depending on what language makes visible or invisible, what kind of language we'll use. In English, we have pejorative terms for women: bossy, controlling, slutty, etc., that we don't use for men, that suggest behavior we think is acceptable in men is unacceptable in women, or that we judge them differently. So understanding how language works and learning to make it work for your own beliefs and values rather than letting, accepted ideas continue without recognition, I also think is the task of every writer.
You are a very prolific author, having published 25 books, more or less, which is quite impressive.
Thank you.
So I wonder, what is the creative and research process behind your books? Do you have some rituals, for example?
Oh, I wish I did. And I have tea exactly the same way every morning when I'm home, and then chaos ensues. And I often joke that I, just mess around all day, every day, and then I go to sleep in the next day. Because it feels, I don't know what you do when you're not interviewing people, but my life feels very disorganized, but somehow I get things done. And it's partly, I think if you write poetry, all you do is write poetry. But if you write nonfiction, you travel, you do research, you interview people, you write, you rewrite, your editor gives it back to you, you edit it again, you fact check, etc. So there's so many different pieces of the process. And I wish I was more organized and had beautiful rituals, but I haven't quite gotten there yet. And yet there are books, so apparently it works well enough.
You have written lucidly about the relationships between thinking and walking, or the advantages of uncertainty and the act of getting lost in the unknown to find something valuable. Is this also relevant to you as an author?
Yeah, and I often, writing is a process of discovering, finding out something out in the world, finding out a new way to think about it. And I feel so lucky that this is what I get to do. And I'm really interested in uncertainty. I think people are very attached to certainty. In a lot of cultures, they find uncertainty terrifying or alarming, or just pretend it's not there. But I feel that possibility is almost another word for uncertainty. A little while ago, I said, we're creating the future in the present. The future is not yet written. And so I feel that in that uncertainty, not knowing quite what you'll write, who you'll meet, how things will turn out, is also a sense of freedom and possibility. And of course, with possibility comes responsibility. If we don't know what's going to happen, but recognize the future is being created in the present, then we also have an obligation to be good citizens of the earth and participate in those decisions. So I've been interested in uncertainty in different ways. And the book Wanderlust, which was about walking, left me with, I felt like I hadn't said enough about getting lost in it, and that produced this other book, A Field Guide to Getting Lost. And then another book around the same time, Hope in the Dark, which is my book about hope, was also about coming to terms with uncertainty, recognizing that, again, that the future is undecided. In a sense, Hope in the Dark was about uncertainty in time, about the politics of the present and how they make the future. A Field Guide was partly about getting lost in places, going beyond what you know, imaginatively, geographically, emotionally, about the necessity of taking risks, about the inevitability of having losses. I think there's a desire people have to be very safe that keeps them from asking questions, exploring, going beyond what they know. And I wrote all these books as smartphones were coming in and people were doing less and less, I think, free exploration. And I don't know how it is here, but a lot of people in the US, you know,
It's the same.
yeah, they use their phone to navigate. And it's interesting, I went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2006, and I found I had before there were smartphones, there were these devices you could put in your car that helped you navigate. And I found that I could use that device 1,000 times and I would still not know where I was and just have to obey the machine. But if I used a paper map, it was like, okay, this street goes like this, and then there's this, you know, that eventually the map was within me and I knew exactly where I was. And that begat another project. I made 3 atlases of maps of cities, creative maps, poetic maps, imaginative maps, to celebrate what both cities were and what maps can be, also with the sense that they're threatened in the age of people walking around like zombies, obeying their phones. And so these books have often been very different, but there's often ideas and values that connect them.
You wanted to be a writer since childhood, from the moment you learned to read.
Almost.
I wonder about the role that reading has played in your life as a writer. Which authors have been significant to you and why?
Yeah, I did actually so I had wanted to be a dancer. Then I learned how to read. For a little while, I wanted to be a librarian because they live with books all day, and what could be more wonderful? And then I realized somebody actually writes those books as I was learning, you know, to write, and made my final career decision at the age of 6. And I didn't write much beyond what I was supposed to in school, and but I read all day, every day after school and on weekends and things. I just kind of disappeared into books, lived in books. And when you're a kid, what does it mean you're going to grow up and be a writer? You imagine the kind of books kids read and then novels. And as a teenager, I was gradually realizing I wasn't going to write novels. And I was going to I didn't know what. Nobody talked about essays in the 1970s. So a huge landmark for me was finding Jorge Luis Borges' book, Labyrinths. I still have the Penguin paperback edition. I think I was in England. It cost 95 pence. It was very cheap. And it's fallen apart. And Borges really first showed me how in a something very short, something that wasn't fiction in the most conventional sense, extraordinary creativity and poetic exploration was possible, as well as a kind of philosophical contemplation of how things are, how they could be, and figures from the past, etc. And so that was a huge landmark for me. And then there's lots of writers: George Orwell, Virginia Woolf, James Baldwin. But since I'm here, I will say South American writers have been really important to me. And before Borges, I read 100 Years of Solitude. Eduardo Galeano has been a really big influence, also as somebody, I think there are 2 writers for me who most perfectly embodied being deeply political while being deeply poetic. And those would be Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas and Eduardo Galeano. And they came later in my life, but have also been a huge influence on how to write about deeply political things without using kind of the dry language of journalism, the stale language of kind of Marxism, how the poetic and the imaginative and the deeply political never were separate, so you don't have to treat them, as I think a lot of English language writers do, as 2 separate realms that don't even intersect.